Hi, Lance Christian here. I'm the Executive Director for ALS Northwest. Thank you for joining us for our ALS 201 session. Today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about what ALS is, who gets it, the myths about ALS, and some deeper understanding of some of the research areas where there's focus on learning more about ALS. So what happens with ALS in the bodies? So ALS is a motor neuron disease. And so the nerves that go out from the brain and the spinal cord to all the voluntary muscles in the body are impacted by ALS. And these are the motor nerves that control sort of all of our muscle movements. So in ALS, the motor neurons are dying in a sort of rapid cascade. We're born with all the motor neurons that we are ever going to have at birth, around 500,000 or slightly more. And over time with ALS, those nerves die. And as that occurs, paralysis occurs and motor function is impacted. So there are multiple forms of the way ALS can onset, and people discover that they maybe are experiencing symptoms of ALS. And that is really impacts by which areas of motor neurons are impacted. And sometimes you may see neurologists just say, this is ALS. And what they mean by that is really that there are both upper and lower motor neurons that are impacted, but sometimes they'll give more specific diagnoses around sort of specific areas of nerves that are impacted. Progressive muscular atrophy is an onset form of ALS where primarily the lower motor neurons that go from the spine out to muscles are impacted. And these are causing symptoms that are related to foot drop, weakness in the extremities, hand function, walking, and ability to perform some daily living tasks. Progressive bulbar palsy or atrophy are really nerves that are really connected to the mouth and the palate. And so sometimes some of the symptoms people might experience with this form of onset are really related to dysarthria, so slurred speech, dysphagia, swallowing problems, or maybe a hoarseness or a nasally voice. And primary lateral sclerosis is another form of motor neuron disease that really just affects the upper motor neurons, so the nerves that go from the brain down the spinal cord. And with that onset, people may initially have issues related to stiffness or spasticity. So depending on which nerves are affected, the onset of ALS and the symptoms can really vary from person to person, which really means that ALS is a heterogeneous disease. It doesn't always look the same or behave the same from person to person. So around 5 to 10% of cases, there's a known familial or genetic risk connected to ALS. So there are multiple genes that are connected to ALS. Researchers have identified over 40 genes that may be connected to ALS. The most common ones are C9orf72, SOD1, ALS2 or ALSA, and FUS. And all of these particular genetic forms of ALS have known genes that cause a high probability or certainty that a family member or person may get ALS. But really, that really is only in about 5 to 10% of cases. But as they learn more about genetics, we're discovering more about also sporadic ALS and why it can also occur in people who don't have a known gene. So who gets ALS? As we mentioned, about 5 to 10% of people have a genetic history within their family, a genetic propensity. But that doesn't mean that genes aren't connected to why someone who has sporadic ALS might be getting the disease. It may be the case that there are certain genes that maybe make someone more susceptible to get ALS, but there may be environmental factor or lifestyle or personal characteristics of physiology that make a person more susceptible. So one of the ways we know to look at this is to look and see who gets the disease. So understanding the natural history of the population who gets the disease. So we know that it's typically people between 40 and 70 who get diagnosed. However, people as young as teenagers and earlier get ALS. There are very rare forms of what's considered juvenile ALS, where kids and even young teens get a form of ALS, but there's also people who are as old as 90 who get diagnosed. Uh, Roughly, according to the National ALS Registry, there's a prevalence of about 9.1 per 100,000, which means at any given time, there's probably around 30,000 people around the United States who have ALS. But unfortunately, because the disease steals our loved ones and people before their time, there's never a huge population that it is living at any one moment with ALS, even though it's touching many, many people. And that means that ALS often is what's called a rare disease, which means that at any given time, there's no more than 200,000 people. And so that plays a role in terms of funding and sometimes lack of funding for research because not a huge population of people in the United States have the disease. In terms of demographics, slightly more men are considered to get ALS than women, but it can occur across all races, ethnicities, and cultural backgrounds. So these are just some sort of characteristics. Interestingly enough, I'll share with you, there was a recent publication by the National ALS Registry that started to look at these 30,000 expected prevalence of ALS. And in a most recent paper identified, they were able to publish state-by-state data in the United States that looked at the prevalence rates in every US state. And one of the unique things that they identified, which is something to study further, is that the states in more northerly latitudes had higher prevalence rates than the states who had more southerly latitudes. And so that's a new area of finding for understanding who gets ALS. It also points to areas of research where scientists can look to investigate and further understand some of the environmental factors that may be part of ALS. So some common myths about ALS is it only impacts older people. We know that's not true. I will share personally, the youngest person I've worked with in my time with ALS Northwest was 21 years old when he was diagnosed. And I also work with people as old as 90. It's typically hereditary. It's not. It's sporadic. Around 90% of people have no familial history of ALS, but it does not mean that there's not some genetic susceptibility to ALS that they may carry within their own physiology. And that ALS doesn't impact cognition. There's been a long time sort of discussion and portrayal within the media in particular that says that ALS is a paralyzing disease, which it is and it can be, but that people's minds are always fully and cognitively intact while their bodies fail them. Well, for many people, that can be true, but they're starting in the early 2000s, there was a particularly large amount of research starting to be done looking at cognitive issues in people with ALS because physicians were noting that there were issues around cognition, behavioral changes, and characteristics of people as they experienced the disease. And some recent studies have really shown that around 50% of people who have ALS maybe experience some cognitive changes. But within that 50%, it can be from very, very mild to some cases which are much, much more severe, which really impacts people's ability to function and to impacts personality, impulsivity, passivity, apathy, and can really impact their daily lives as well as the type of care that they need as the disease progresses. So assessing that and understanding it is very important for the clinicians so that the caregivers who are supporting people with ALS can have the most appropriate supports that they may need. And if there are cognitive changes, studying those and understanding what's happening with each person is important, primarily right now so that we can understand how best to support the family caregivers. So there's many areas of ALS where people are looking at study for scientific purposes. We're going to talk a little bit about a few of these. Each one of these really has an amazing amount of drilled detail into them in which you could really spend entire days and weeks reading more and understanding. And what I'm excited by was within the ALS scientific community, there are many, many amazing researchers who have chosen ALS as their field of study and are working very hard on this topic. Truly, since the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge in 2014, it's been a true explosion of the number of researchers who are really focusing on ALS. The awareness and the funds that came in during that time prompted a sort of spark of continued interest that is carried as young scientists started studying ALS and moved further into their careers. So we'll talk a little bit about clinical trials, biomarkers, environmental factors, all these different types of things, but we'll talk just touching on them, knowing that there's so much more that we could go into in each category. Biomarkers is a very important topic. You may see that term in many research studies. And truly, these days, most scientifically funded research studies, particularly looking at trying to test therapies, may have a component of trying to study biomarkers as part of as a funding piece of a component of a study. So what is a biomarker? So really, what we're trying to do, as you may know, either through your lived experience or through research, that there's no one test that fully identifies a person has ALS. It's a culmination of observation and clinical presentation and electromyogram testing to look for nerve conduction damage within motor neurons. And so really it is a preponderance of the evidence that leads to an ALS diagnosis. Well, the challenge of that is that roughly half a person's motor neurons may already be gone or dead before someone gets to a diagnosis of ALS. And so if there are ways to identify that there was early damage and hindrance to motor neurons, if there are ways to test for that weren't just based on evidence of clinical symptoms, it could really show us one early diagnosis for people with ALS, but also in clinical studies, being able to identify items that can show, is a treatment that's being tested effective or not effective? Does it have an impact across the clinical trial? Most clinical trials will certainly look at changes in physical function, respiratory function, but it would be amazing if we could find something like a blood marker, biomarker, something in urine, something in physical imaging that would indicate to give us indicators that treatments are effective or slowing the disease. And so as we talked a little bit about clinical studies, the clinical trials, that is sort of the end of the pipeline of ALS research. And it's where compounds or therapies that have been developed, often starting on the lab bench, moving into translational research, and then further into clinical trials, either phase 1, phase 2, or phase 3 clinical trials, are being tested for efficacy, working with amazing and heroic people with ALS who volunteer their time, energy, and experience to test therapies to see if they're effective. Phase 1 trials are really just specifically looking to see if things are safe. We want to make sure that medications don't cause harm. And that's a very important step in the clinical trial process. Phase 2 studies expands the numbers a little bit. Instead of just looking at safety, they're also trying to look and see with a smaller group of people, is there efficacy that would warrant further investment in studying a particular therapy for clinical effectiveness. And when the preponderance of evidence from a phase 2 trial shows that there may be benefit, a larger phase 3 trial, usually multi-center across the United States, Canada, Europe, Asia, Australia, can really be put in place to test hundreds of people with ALS to see, does a particular therapy have an impact once you expand the population group receiving it, to see if it affects not just a small population, but is it reach its statistically valid endpoints across a large group of people. Another area of research which is very important is looking at environmental factors. There is a national ALS registry here in the United States where people can register with the Center for Disease Control, Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registries, where identifying you have ALS and then participate in a number of different lifestyle surveys that really look at a variety of things: physical activity, occupational choice, reproductive health, um, physical trauma, and a whole slew of lifestyle questions to see what are the common characteristics that may involve people getting ALS. Because while there may be a genetic susceptibility, there may also be environmental factors. And this goes back really into the 1980s, where an early study found with European soccer players that soccer players in Europe, Italian soccer players to be specific, were getting ALS at a higher population. Well, why is that? Further studies continue to show that people who engage in high stress physical activities have a slightly higher likelihood of developing ALS. And we see this in the United States as well, connected to professional athletes, particularly football players. And one environmental factor that could be part of this, and this could be true for soccer too, is head trauma. And head trauma could be an environmental factor because of in European soccer, headers, and in American football, concussion is a common theme. All these things are factors that are not necessarily causative. And so scientists are always looking for those interactions that can give clues, one, to prevent ALS, but also to understand what triggers ALS in people. So disease models are often the starting place for a lot of research. This is what I call the true bench scientists, the folks who are in the academic labs and the pharma labs, and that are really looking at the function of motor neurons, how they intersect with the muscles, the astrocytes in the muscles, the proteins and the genes that trigger protein development. And they're doing the amazing deep dive academic work that really looks at what is happening within motor neurons, muscles, the central and peripheral nervous system, and some of the potential compounds, whether they're and therapies that could truly make a difference and intercede. And sometimes it's those little sparks of those ideas that lead to translational research, which is the how do you take that scientific finding of understanding a disease mechanism. For example, if you find a researcher discovers a gene, that gene has an impact on motor nerve function. Okay, how do you intersect or engage to create a therapy that interferes or promotes that particular mechanism? And then how do you get it into the cells and into the nervous system to create a therapy that people can access? And all of this, of course, as I mentioned, is related back to genetics. And genetics, of course, are the blueprint of everything that we do that happens within our bodies. And understanding which genes are impacting motor nerves, is the sort of clue in terms of looking at areas to create interventions. Now, precision medicine is an amazing newer area of research. And the idea being really is ALS is a heterogeneous disease. So it doesn't look the same from person to person. There may be a person who has limb onset ALS, maybe primary progressive muscular atrophy, and they're experiencing problems with their arms and legs and their outer extremities. Another person may have bulbar symptoms and problems with speech and swallowing. Some people may have very slowly progressive disease, some very rapidly progressive. So that really points to the idea that ALS is not a sort of singular thing, that there probably isn't a single treatment that's going to be effective for ALS, but it may be that there's multiple therapies that could make a difference, and trying to match those unique individual therapies to match the characteristics of the person and the type of ALS they have. And so moving into the future, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of research looking at, why do certain therapies potentially work better for some people and not for others? how can we use biomarkers to identify maybe who those people are that respond strongly to particular therapies, and develop precision medicine interventions so that we can match therapies to the type of ALS that a person may have. It's a growth area for the future, and it's in a very exciting time as scientists and researchers discover more about some of the different mechanisms of ALS and develop unique individual therapies. And it may be the case in the future that the treatments for ALS may really be different from person to person with the diagnosis. We've talked a little bit about disease mechanisms, but natural history studies are also very important. Really looking at the disease's evolution and how variable the disease is, and looking back at some of the history of populations of people who've had ALS. And here's some examples. Is national registries is sort of an example of this. I mentioned recently in a previous slide that they're finding ALS is more common in more northerly latitudes in the states in the United States. For a while back, there was a national registry in Ireland that showed that people in northwestern Ireland were developing ALS at really a much higher rate than people in other parts of Ireland. So that tells us something either about the genetics or the environment. And so these natural history studies, looking at who gets ALS, where, what are those characteristics of people, can really point scientists to kind of hone in on environmental and or individual population characteristics that might indicate a higher susceptibility to ALS, and then point people to, and scientists, to areas for continued research. So this is just the tip of the iceberg of understanding ALS research, its characteristics of the disease, and understanding more about ALS. There are many resources available online, as well as journal articles. Some of these resources are listed here. They'll be in the description of this video. But also know that your team here at ALS Northwest are happy to meet with you and connect and discuss all of these things. There is an amazing hub of people who care about ALS doing ALS research across the United States, across the world, here in Oregon. Clinical trial opportunities and basic people who are doing good basic science, even here in our local communities. ALS can feel like an overwhelming problem to solve, but I have hope and faith that progress is being made because I see the brilliant minds who are working on it and are determined to make a difference for people living with ALS. So thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate you and look forward to connecting with you at a future ALS Research Symposium or some other ALS Northwest event. And we always want to talk more about ALS research.